Archaeologists uncovered a massive stone structure in the ancient city of Megiddo, and it doesn't fit where history says it should. At first glance, it looks like just another ruin. Weathered stones, broken walls, layers of dust shaped by centuries of wind and silence. But this structure refuses to stay quiet. Its placement, its scale, and its design introduce a problem that doesn't disappear no matter how many times the data is rechecked. The stones themselves are not unusual individually. Limestone blocks, carefully cut, laid with precision. What makes them unsettling is how deliberately they were assembled. This wasn't improvised construction. It wasn't local experimentation. It was planned, coordinated, and executed with a level of authority that implies something far larger operating behind the scenes. For decades, historians taught a relatively stable story about this period. Kingdoms grew slowly. Power consolidated gradually. Monumental architecture arrived only after administrative systems were firmly in place. But this structure interrupts that sequence. It appears fully formed, as if the society that built it had already solved problems it was not supposed to have encountered yet. The excavation records are clear. The stratigraphy is documented. The measurements are precise. Nothing about this discovery depends on legend or interpretation. The problem isn't whether the structure exists. The problem is that, according to the accepted historical framework, it shouldn't. When archaeologists first began to expose the outline of the structure, there was no immediate alarm. Discoveries like this happen all the time. But as more of it emerged, the pattern became harder to ignore. The symmetry, the scale, the standardized layout. This wasn't the work of a small, loosely organized settlement. It suggested centralized planning, shared architectural knowledge, and a governing authority capable of enforcing uniform design. That implication alone creates friction. Because once you accept centralized planning, you must accept centralized power. And once you accept centralized power, you must ask who held it, when they held it, and how long it had already existed before the structure was built. This is where the discomfort begins. Because history is not just a collection of facts, it is a system of agreements. Timelines align because generations of scholars have agreed they do. And when a single object threatens that alignment, it doesn't merely add information, it introduces instability. The dating methods applied to the structure were not experimental or fringe. They followed standard archaeological procedures. Ceramic analysis, stratigraphic correlation, comparative architecture. Each method on its own might allow flexibility. Together, they form a convergence that is difficult to dismiss. If the dating holds, then the political and administrative capacity implied by the structure existed earlier than traditionally accepted. That doesn't simply adjust a date on a timeline. It reshapes assumptions about how quickly societies organized, how power emerged, and how biblical narratives relate to material history. This is not a sensational claim. There are no dramatic declarations here. No announcement that everything we know is wrong. But there is a quiet tension that refuses to resolve. Because once you see the structure for what it is, you can't unsee the implications. And that is why this discovery matters. Not because it proves something extraordinary, but because it forces a question historians are uncomfortable answering. What if the foundations of one of the most famous biblical kingdoms were already standing before we thought they were built? The artifact does not argue. It does not explain itself. It simply exists, solid and immovable, asking whether our timelines are as stable as we assume, or whether they survive only because no one has pushed them hard enough yet. By the end of this video, you will have a clearer understanding of what this structure actually represents, not as a symbol or a legend, but as a physical object anchored in stone, location, and method. You will see why its design matters, why its placement is so specific, and why archaeologists did not dismiss it as an anomaly or a curiosity. This is not about speculation layered on top of ancient ruins. It is about following the implications of evidence to their logical end, even when that end is uncomfortable. You will also see why this discovery does not neatly fit within the timelines most people learned. Biblical history, as it is commonly presented, often relies on clean transitions. One king rises, another falls, cities grow, walls appear, administration follows. This structure disrupts that simplicity. It suggests a level of organization that appears earlier than expected, raising questions not about faith, but about chronology. Understanding this tension is essential, because it changes how the entire period is interpreted. Finally, you will understand why this evidence was not loudly debated outside academic circles. Not because it was hidden, and not because it was rejected, but because it created a problem with no immediate resolution. Scholars prefer debates they can eventually close. This one remains open. Acknowledging it publicly means admitting that certain historical models may be incomplete, and that admission carries consequences for education, publication, and long-standing consensus. Throughout this video, the focus will remain narrow and deliberate. We are not chasing every theory or fringe idea connected to Solomon's reign. We are examining one structure, one site, and one set of implications. That restraint matters. When conclusions are limited to what the evidence actually supports, the questions that remain become sharper, not weaker. You will notice that nothing here requires rejecting scripture or embracing revisionism. The issue is not whether the biblical account is true, but how it should be read alongside material evidence. Archaeology does not replace the text. It places pressure on interpretation. And when that pressure builds, it reveals where assumptions have been quietly filling gaps that evidence has not. This video is not asking you to choose between belief and skepticism. It is asking you to recognize that history is constructed through layers of interpretation, just like an archaeological site is built through layers of occupation. When a new layer appears where none was expected, the responsible response is not denial, but examination. By the end, you will be able to see why this discovery matters beyond Solomon himself. It affects how we understand early state formation, the speed of political development, and the relationship between narrative tradition and physical remains. These are not abstract academic concerns. They shape how entire civilizations are taught and remembered. Most importantly, you will see why this structure could not simply be ignored, yet could not easily be explained away either. It sits in an uncomfortable space between acceptance and uncertainty, and it is precisely in that space that the most meaningful historical questions tend to emerge. Megiddo is not an obscure location pulled from the margins of history. It sits in a narrow corridor that once controlled trade routes moving between Egypt, the coastal plains, and the interior of the Levant. Whoever held this city did not merely occupy land. They influenced movement, commerce, and military strategy across the region. That strategic value is precisely why Megiddo appears repeatedly in biblical narratives, and why it has been excavated layer by layer for more than a century. What matters here is not the full history of the site, but how its importance frames the discovery in question. Megiddo was not a place where large-scale construction happened accidentally. Any monumental structure built there implies intention, resources, and authority. It suggests that someone had both the reason and the ability to shape the city according to a broader political vision. Biblical texts describe Megiddo as part of a network of fortified cities associated with Solomon's reign. In that narrative, these cities represent the height of centralized power, administrative order, and economic reach. They are presented as outcomes of a kingdom that had matured, stabilized, and accumulated wealth over time. That framing has shaped how archaeologists and historians initially approach the site. Modern excavations, however, are not guided by the biblical narrative. They follow stratigraphy, material culture, and comparative analysis. Teams from Tel Aviv University approached Megiddo not to confirm scripture, but to understand the sequence of occupation. Their goal was to map layers accurately, not to prove or disprove any text. As trenches deepened, layers emerged in expected order. Pottery styles shifted gradually. Domestic structures reflected changes in daily life. But when the level associated with large-scale fortification was exposed, it did not align cleanly with the sequence above and below it. The architecture appeared too organized, too standardized, and too complete for what the traditional timeline would predict at that point. This is where context becomes critical. Megiddo is not an isolated case. Its architectural patterns can only be understood in relation to other major sites in the region. When similar gate complexes and city layouts appear hundreds of kilometers apart, the question is no longer local development. It becomes regional coordination. Context also includes who was present in the region at the time. The Levant was not empty or static. Competing city-states, external empires, and shifting alliances all shaped what was possible. Building something monumental in Megiddo required not just local labor, but political stability and protection from external disruption. That reality forces a re-evaluation of assumptions. If such stability existed earlier than expected, then the social and political landscape of the region must be reconsidered. This does not demand rewriting biblical accounts, but it does require acknowledging that the processes behind them may have been more complex and less linear than traditionally portrayed. The controlled context here serves a purpose. It narrows the focus. It prevents the discussion from drifting into speculation about motives, beliefs, or theology. What remains is a grounded question rooted in geography, power, and material evidence. Megiddo was a city that mattered. Whatever was built there mattered as well. And understanding why it appears when it does is essential to understanding the kingdom it is associated with. What was uncovered at the site is not a fragment or a decorative element, but a complete architectural system. The structure consists of a large gate complex built with 6 internal chambers, arranged symmetrically on either side of a central passage. Each chamber is nearly identical in size and shape, suggesting that they were not added over time, but planned together from the outset. This level of symmetry is not incidental. It reflects forethought, measurement, and adherence to a standardized design. The stones used in the construction are carefully cut ashlar blocks. They are not roughly shaped or reused from earlier buildings. Their uniformity indicates access to skilled labor and specialized tools. Quarrying, transporting, and positioning stones of this size would have required coordination well beyond what a small or loosely organized settlement could achieve. The material itself does not tell a story, but the way it was used does. The gate is integrated directly into the city wall, rather than appended as an afterthought. This integration matters. It means the wall and the gate were conceived as a single defensive system. There is no visible improvisation, no sign that the structure evolved in response to later threats. It appears as a finished solution to a problem that had already been anticipated. The internal layout of the chambers suggests multiple functions. Some show evidence of benches built into the walls, implying administrative or judicial use. Others appear suited for storage or guard activity. This multifunctional design points to an organized civic life, where the gate was not merely an entry point but a center of control and regulation. That level of complexity reflects an understanding of governance, not just defense. Equally significant is the writing, or rather, the absence of it. There are no inscriptions carved into the stones. No dedicati texts. No names or titles preserved on the structure itself. This absence removes the temptation to jump to conclusions based on explicit claims. What remains are observable features, dimensions, layout, construction technique, and context within the city. When this gate is compared to similar structures found at Hazor and Gezer, the similarities are striking. The dimensions align closely. The internal chamber arrangement follows the same pattern. The construction techniques are nearly identical. Such consistency across distant sites suggests coordination from a central authority rather than independent local decisions. This is not interpretation layered onto wishful thinking. It is pattern recognition grounded in physical evidence. Independent communities might share styles or influences, but they rarely replicate complex architectural systems with this level of precision unless guided by shared planning. The object, taken on its own, makes no historical claims. It does not assert the name of a king or the boundaries of a kingdom, but it does demonstrate capacity. It shows what the society that built it was capable of organizing, funding, and enforcing. And that capacity is the heart of the problem. Because once you acknowledge what this structure represents in practical terms, you are forced to ask whether the traditional historical framework adequately accounts for such sophistication at this stage. The gate stands there, silent and unyielding, not asking to be believed, but demanding to be explained. According to the traditionally accepted historical framework, the level of organization implied by this structure should not appear at this point in time. Large, standardized architectural projects are typically associated with fully developed state systems, where taxation, labor conscription, and administrative oversight are already functioning smoothly. In the conventional timeline, those systems emerge gradually and reach maturity during Solomon's reign, not before it. This is where the tension becomes unavoidable. The gate complex does not reflect experimentation or early development. It reflects execution. Everything about it suggests that the builders already knew what they were doing. The design is not tentative. The construction is not uneven. There is no visible learning curve carved into the stone. That absence matters, because societies leave traces of their development when they are still figuring things out. If this structure truly dates earlier than the traditional Solomonic period, then the implications ripple outward. It would mean that centralized authority capable of planning and enforcing uniform construction standards existed sooner than expected. That authority would have required not just leadership, but systems, logistics, supply chains, skilled labor networks, and the political power to mobilize them. The historical model most people are familiar with struggles to accommodate that possibility. It assumes a relatively slow consolidation of power following the period of the judges, with fragmentation gradually giving way to unity. Monumental architecture, in that view, marks the culmination of that process. But the physical evidence suggests something more compressed, more accelerated, or perhaps already underway before the narrative places it. This creates a dilemma rather than a conclusion. One option is to question the dating. Archaeology, after all, works with probabilities, not certainties. Radiocarbon ranges overlap. Pottery typologies allow margins of error. Reassigning the structure to a slightly later phase would restore alignment with the accepted timeline. That solution is tempting precisely because it preserves existing models with minimal disruption. The other option is more unsettling. It requires accepting that the political and administrative foundations attributed to Solomon may not have originated with him alone. Instead of a sudden flowering, there may have been continuity from earlier leadership, with Solomon inheriting and expanding an existing system. That does not diminish his reign, but it reframes it. This tension is not about proving the Bible wrong or right. It is about recognizing that historical narratives simplify processes that are often messy and uneven. Texts compress time. Archaeology stretches it out. When those two perspectives collide, the result is friction, not falsification. What makes this problem particularly resistant is that neither side can be dismissed easily. The text has coherence and tradition behind it. The material evidence has weight, consistency, and physical presence. Each supports a plausible interpretation. Neither offers a complete answer on its own. And so the conflict remains unresolved. The structure stands as evidence of capacity that seems premature. The timeline stands as a framework that struggles to absorb it fully. The challenge is not choosing which to believe, but understanding why they do not align as neatly as expected. When confronted with a problem like this, scholars do not rush to dramatic conclusions. The first instinct is to look for explanations that preserve as much of the existing framework as possible. This is not a flaw in the academic process. It is how cumulative knowledge remains stable while still allowing for revision. In this case, several explanations have been proposed, each grounded in established methodology and each addressing part of the problem without fully dissolving it. One common explanation suggests that the structure was built later than the earliest estimates indicate. Dating methods, particularly those relying on associated pottery and organic material, are rarely precise to the exact year. Shifting the construction forward by a few decades would place it comfortably within the reigns of later monarchs, preserving the idea that monumental architecture followed the full consolidation of the kingdom. This explanation is methodologically sound, but it leaves open the question of why multiple independent indicators converge on an earlier phase. Another proposal emphasizes regional architectural traditions rather than centralized authority. According to this view, similar environmental conditions, shared cultural practices, and common defensive needs could have led different cities to adopt similar designs independently. The gate, then, would reflect a shared solution rather than a shared command. While this explanation accounts for stylistic similarities, it struggles to explain the near-identical measurements and internal layouts found across distant sites. A third explanation focuses on the elasticity of archaeological categories themselves. Period labels such as early or late Iron Age are tools, not absolute realities. Boundaries between them are often blurred. From this perspective, the conflict may be less dramatic than it appears, arising from the artificial rigidity of modern classifications. This argument highlights a real limitation of archaeological language, but it does not eliminate the underlying issue of administrative capacity implied by the structure. Each of these explanations has merit, and none should be dismissed casually. In fact, their coexistence strengthens the credibility of the discussion. It shows that the evidence is being engaged seriously rather than forced into a single narrative. At the same time, their limitations are equally important. None of them fully accounts for the convergence of architectural standardization, strategic placement, and apparent coordination across the region. This is where scholarly restraint becomes visible. Rather than declaring a definitive resolution, many researchers leave the question open. They acknowledge the anomaly, propose adjustments, and continue excavating. This approach can appear unsatisfying to those seeking clear answers, but it reflects intellectual honesty. Admitting uncertainty is preferable to overstating confidence. What emerges from these official explanations is not denial, but caution. The academic community recognizes that the evidence points towards something significant, yet resists collapsing complexity into a single explanation prematurely. That resistance is often misunderstood as avoidance, but it is more accurately described as methodological discipline. The result is a quiet tension within the field. The structure is accepted as real. Its features are documented. Its implications are acknowledged. But its full significance remains suspended, waiting for additional data, refined methods, or new discoveries that might tip the balance one way or the other. What emerges when the evidence is taken seriously is not a contradiction of Scripture, but a deepening of it. The structure does not invalidate the biblical account of Solomon's kingdom. Instead, it challenges the assumption that history unfolds in clean, isolated stages. Texts tend to compress generations into narratives that emphasize meaning over process. Stones, by contrast, preserve process without interpretation. When the two are read together, the result is not conflict, but complexity. If centralized architecture existed earlier than traditionally assumed, then Solomon's reign may represent consolidation rather than creation. This reframes the kingdom not as a sudden achievement, but as the visible peak of a longer development. Administrative systems, labor organization, and political authority do not appear overnight. They form gradually, often invisibly, until a moment when they become undeniable. Solomon may have inherited a framework already capable of supporting monumental projects and expanded it to its fullest expression. This perspective aligns with how societies elsewhere developed. Political structures rarely emerge fully formed. They are tested, adjusted, and reinforced over time. The biblical narrative, focused on theological significance, does not always dwell on those incremental steps. Archaeology, however, is sensitive to them. It reveals continuity where texts emphasize turning points. Understanding this helps bridge a false divide between faith and evidence. The Bible was never intended to function as a modern administrative record. Its purpose is moral, theological, and narrative. Expecting it to map precisely onto archaeological sequences imposes a modern standard on an ancient text. At the same time, ignoring material evidence in favor of rigid interpretation limits understanding rather than protecting belief. The structure at Megiddo invites a more mature reading of history, one that allows for overlap, inheritance, and gradual transformation. It suggests that Israel's political sophistication may have been underestimated, not exaggerated. That realization carries implications beyond Solomon himself. It affects how early leadership, social organization, and regional influence are understood across the entire period. This also reshapes how authority is perceived. Rather than attributing progress to a single figure, it highlights collective development. Kings operate within systems. They inherit strengths and weaknesses shaped by those who came before them. Recognizing this does not diminish Solomon's significance. It situates it within a broader human story. Most importantly, this approach resists simplistic conclusions. It does not demand that the viewer choose between belief and doubt. Instead, it encourages patience. Historical understanding grows as evidence accumulates. Each discovery adds nuance rather than finality. The significance of this structure lies not in the answers it provides, but in the questions it sustains. It reminds us that certainty is often provisional, and that the past is more layered than the stories we tell about it. In that sense, the evidence does not weaken history or scripture. It invites both to be read with greater depth, humility, and attention to the unseen processes that shape visible outcomes. The absence of loud debate around this discovery often invites misunderstanding. It can appear as if something important was overlooked or deliberately minimized. But the reality is more subtle and far less dramatic. Institutions responsible for preserving and teaching history operate within constraints that favor clarity, continuity, and consensus. When evidence introduces ambiguity rather than resolution, it becomes difficult to integrate into established narratives. Educational frameworks, in particular, rely on stable timelines. Students are taught sequences that can be tested, repeated, and summarized. A discovery that complicates rather than replaces those sequences poses a practical challenge. It cannot easily be reduced to a single conclusion, and so it tends to remain within specialist discussions rather than entering textbooks or popular accounts. There is also the issue of proportional significance. Archaeology produces anomalies regularly. Most are resolved over time as new data emerges. Scholars are trained to avoid overemphasizing individual finds until patterns are firmly established. In this case, the structure is compelling, but it does not stand alone. Its implications depend on how it aligns with other sites, other layers, and other forms of evidence. Until that alignment reaches a tipping point, caution prevails. Institutional inertia plays a role as well. Academic consensus is built slowly, through peer review, replication, and debate. Shifting it requires not just one persuasive argument, but sustained agreement across disciplines. That process can take decades. During that time, discoveries may be acknowledged without being foregrounded. This is not suppression, it is the pace at which complex systems adapt. There is also a human dimension that is rarely discussed. Scholars invest years, sometimes entire careers, in particular models of interpretation. When new evidence challenges those models, the response is not hostility, but hesitation. Revising foundational assumptions demands careful consideration, not impulsive revision. This conservatism is often misread, but it serves a protective function within the field. Another factor is communication. Public discourse often favors definitive statements over nuanced analysis. Presenting a discovery that raises questions without offering closure risks misunderstanding or misuse. Rather than fuel speculation, many researchers choose to frame such findings cautiously, emphasizing what is known while resisting extrapolation. As a result, the discovery occupies an in-between space. It is cited in academic literature. It is discussed in conferences. It informs ongoing research. But it does not dominate the narrative. It remains present without being emphasized, acknowledged without being elevated. This pattern reveals something important about how knowledge evolves. Not every discovery triggers a revolution. Many work quietly, reshaping understanding incrementally. They influence future interpretations without announcing themselves dramatically. The structure at Megiddo fits that pattern. It was not ignored because it lacked importance, but because its importance resists simplification. It asks questions that cannot be answered quickly or conclusively. And in institutions built to transmit clarity, such questions tend to wait patiently until the broader framework is ready to absorb them. History is rarely transformed by a single discovery, no matter how striking it appears at first glance. More often, change comes through accumulation, as evidence quietly reshapes the boundaries of what is considered certain. The structure uncovered at Megiddo belongs to that category. It does not demand immediate revision, nor does it collapse established narratives. Instead, it applies pressure, testing how resilient our assumptions truly are. What this discovery ultimately reveals is not a definitive alternative timeline, but the limits of confidence. Historical models are built to organize information, not to freeze it permanently. They function best when they remain open to adjustment. The gate complex does not insist on a new conclusion, it insists on attention. It asks whether the emphasis placed on certain periods, figures, or interpretations has overshadowed more gradual developments that archaeology is uniquely positioned to detect. This is where the distinction between discovery and emphasis becomes critical. Many artifacts exist within archives, publications, and site reports without ever shaping public understanding. Not because they lack importance, but because they complicate rather than clarify. The past, however, is not obligated to be simple. It unfolds through overlapping processes, inherited systems, and partial continuities. When those realities surface, they challenge the narratives that prefer clear beginnings and endings. The structure at Megiddo encourages a more disciplined form of curiosity. It invites examination without urgency, reflection without sensationalism. It reminds us that belief and rejection are not the only responses available. There is also patience. The willingness to let questions remain open while evidence continues to accumulate. This approach does not weaken historical study, it strengthens it. A discipline that allows uncertainty to exist openly is better equipped to integrate new findings honestly. It also creates space for dialogue between text and material culture, rather than forcing one to dominate the other. Scripture and archaeology, when allowed to speak in their own registers, illuminate different aspects of the same past. As research continues, this structure will not disappear. Future excavations, improved dating techniques, and comparative studies will either reinforce its implications or contextualize them further. Either outcome is valuable. What matters is that the question remains alive. Looking ahead, this discovery serves as a reminder that history is not only written by what is found, but by what scholars choose to foreground. Emphasis shapes understanding just as powerfully as evidence. Recognizing that process allows us to read the past more critically and more honestly. And in the next exploration, attention will turn to another archaeological find that carries a similar quiet weight. A discovery that does not shout for recognition, but waits patiently, challenging what we think we know by simply refusing to fit where it is expected to belong.